this opportunity. My husband told me that he was speaking about his mother, but he hadn't had any other volunteers. And I said, well, I spoke about my mother back when Pastor Leslie was here, and about my father when David Moser was here. So I've spoken about my actual mother and my actual father. I said, would it be okay if I spoke about May? May's easily the most colorful character in our whole family. Her name was May. And as my husband Chris has said, quote, she had May West energy all over her. And she did. She was my mother's father's second wife. They were called Grandpa McCoy and May. It was not until at my wedding that I thought of her differently. Chris's mother, Betty, with her South Carolina accent, came up to me and said, I'm so glad I got to meet your step-grandma. I know I had a bewildered look on my face, which led Betty to graciously volunteer, your step-grandma May? You see, she was always May to me and my brother. Let me clarify that. My mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, Granny McCoy, she died before I was born. She was just 43 years old when she died. My mother was 8 months pregnant with me at the time. My maternal grandfather, Grandpa McCoy, got remarried rather quickly when I was but a few months old, which must have raised a few eyebrows back in the 1950s. And to my mother, they became Dad and May, and to us, Grandpa and May. May was a character. She claimed that her grandfather stole her grandmother out of a Turkish harem, stowed her away on a ship, brought her to America, and married her. May had been married before, but had no children of her own. Uncle Pete always said that May was a floozy. But Grandpa McCoy seemed to relish her company. And finally, he had a partner in life who loved drinking as much as he did. Apparently, my mother's mother, Granny McCoy, did not approve of his drinking and tried to keep him in line. Not May. And yet, these second-chance drinking buddies had no DUIs. They were both well-employed, even winning awards in their professions. And whatever you grow up with is normal, right? May was little, barely 5 feet tall, probably a size 5 or maybe a 7 after she gained a few pounds with maturity. But she could drink men under the table who were twice her size. She had different expressions to describe degrees of being drunk. There was falling down drunk, which she disapproved of. And worse yet was snot flying drunk, which was even more objectionable. She had standards. Drinking was acceptable as long as you were high functioning, but losing control was not. She had an arresting sense of fashion. She claimed that she dressed high fashion. I'm not sure where to begin on that one. Let me leave you with an image that haunted my preteen years. When I was in middle school in the late 1960s, May would have been in her early 60s. She came to our house one Christmas in black stiletto heels, fishnet stockings, a black leather miniskirt, a leopard skin-tight top, shoulder-length platinum hair, and a black leather hat with a leopard skin band. Believe me, nobody else's grandmother dressed like that. While she might have been inspired by Nancy Sinatra, she was on brand pathetic in terms of Madonna's fashions 15 years later. Let's just say that May's look certainly did get looks, and she did dress progressively. Let's just call her fashion fearless. Sometime in the 1970s, my mother's father died, my Grandpa McCoy. It seems that Grandpa McCoy's drinking did catch up with him. May mourned his passing and did not remarry until about a year later. She met a very gracious man named Duke, who was a widower, and found May fascinating. They were happy together for a few years when Duke's health started to grow uncertain. He insisted on setting up his estate to benefit his children and his current wife, May. Duke passed as softly and gently as he had lived. Suddenly, May had to decide between keeping the apartment in Springfield, moving to Duke's house in Indiana, or Duke's house in Florida. Eventually, she chose Florida. Duh. Last time I recall seeing May, she was walking across the old Capitol Plaza downtown. She would have been in her early 80s. She was dressed in white platform sandals, yellow capri pants, and a yellow and white strapless tube top, with her golden blonde hair in an updo. She was striking, and she still had a walk that really stood out with these platform sandals. She must have been an inspiration to aging drag queens everywhere she went. But the truth is, even in her 80s, I don't know how she did it in terms of undergarments, but she looked darn good in that tube top. We hugged, and I wished her well. And then in the next few months, I heard she'd moved to Florida. Shortly after moving to Florida, my mother heard that May had met someone and that they had decided just to live together rather than get married. He moved into the Florida house that May inherited from Duke, her third husband. Then we learned that her new male companion was just 49 years old. We all assumed it would be a convenient arrangement, and in exchange for looking after her, he could rightfully collect her estate. They lived together for, I believe, 5 years until May passed at the age of 88. He claimed her last words were, quote, "I love you. Now bring me my martini." She took a deep sip, swallowed, reclined, and died. What a peaceful way to go. I'm pretty sure her hair was done and she was wearing makeup. Although her life pathway was unorthodox, I believe that she really did follow her bliss. Wherever she went, she seemed to have a lot of friends. And 3 husbands and a live-in boyfriend 30 plus years younger for a woman born in the early 1900s wasn't bad. And perhaps medical science should have studied the impact of her long-term alcohol consumption. But May had one more surprise for each of us. Although she claimed that most of her estate was from her third husband, and no one doubted that it was, she made a point of treating all of her former husband's children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews equitably. After she died, and her much younger boyfriend settled her estate, we all received a registered letter from a firm of attorneys in Florida. I remember that Callie was an infant in my arms when our mailman rang our doorbell. "Ms. Smith, I'm gonna need a signature for this one." I looked at him and felt like I was about to be sued or named in a lawsuit for reasons I could not imagine. I said, "My heart is in my mouth." Our postman said, "Well, it might be something good. You know somebody in Florida?" I blanked for the moment as I hadn't had much sleep in my new role as first-time mom. When I opened the envelope, there was a letter from May's attorneys and a much bigger check than I could have imagined. And there was a note from boyfriend John, whom I must say was more honest and forthright than any of us might have given him credit prior to this. May had not forgotten any of us. But what May gave me was more than monetary. While we did not see much of my Grandpa McCoy and May, usually just a couple times a year, and they did live in the same town, through May, there was a fairness and an impartiality that does not always exist within more traditionally aligned families. My paternal grandmother, my Grandma Nicholson, my father's mother, was really the only grandmother I knew rather well growing up. But she had favorites, and I was not one of them. And she was not particularly concerned with appearing impartial. It was rather obvious during her lifetime and glaringly apparent at the reading of her last will and testament. It's not so much the money in my case, but it is the thought that still hurts. Even from the grave, she reminded me that I was not one of her favorites. That was my paternal grandmother. But then, a few years later, there was May, my maternal step-grandmother, speaking from the grave, reminding me that I was just as valid and worthwhile as all of the other descendants in her family from all of her former husbands. That was healing, and that gave me back some of my wholeness that my paternal birth grandmother had taken from me. And so, on Mother's Day, May, although you never gave birth or raised or nurtured a child, I celebrate you for loving us impartially and equitably. And especially, I thank you for coining a rather daring fashion look while in your 60s, one that would not be fully manifested until Madonna stole that same high fashion look 15 years later. For everything you were and everything you were not, I am so grateful. And now, from across the universe, I'm happy to say, thank you, May. I celebrate you and I love you. And remember just one thing, her name was May.
Thank you, Debbie. In 1989, a movie came out entitled Steel Magnolias. Since my parents were born and raised in the South, and since the movie was about Southern women, I asked my dad if he was going to take Mom to see the movie. He laughed and replied, "I don't need to see it. I married one." That's it. That's basically the whole message. There's some details here. Since we have some time, I'll go on. For this talk, I Googled steel magnolia, and it defined the term as a woman who exemplifies both traditional femininity and an uncommon fortitude. Before Steel Magnolias was a movie, it was a book, and the author said it meant a woman as delicate as a flower and as hard as steel. I was born and raised in Springfield, Illinois, but most of my extended family on both sides were in the Carolinas, and every other summer we would vacation there at Crescent, now North Myrtle Beach. There I observed the practice of Southern gentility, and I learned there are nuances to it. A true Southerner could dissect this much more minutely and expertly than me, but I observed at least 4 levels of it. And over time, I could usually pick up from my mother which level was in play. Now, mind you, to the untrained observer, these interactions all appear exactly the same. The first level is the totally unguarded, warm, friendly interaction you share with someone you know and trust. The second level was with someone unknown or lesser known. On the surface, the same, but underneath there was a slight caution. And I don't know you, and so I need to be a bit on my guard. The third level, again on the surface the same, but in this case, an awareness that mother was dealing with a snake in the grass. I will be warm and friendly, but I know enough not to turn my back on you or say anything I don't want you to know. The fourth level, and this was never my mother, was, I am the snake in the grass, and just like the snake in the Garden of Eden, I want to really mess with you. My mother was born and raised in Columbia, South Carolina, identical twin to her sister Ann. Her parents were kind, gentle, loving Methodists who acted with charity towards all. My grandfather was fortunate to be gainfully employed throughout the Depression, treasurer of a small company, which enabled a safe and solidly middle-class upbringing for my mother. During that time, the Depression, it was not uncommon for vagrants, mostly men, to show up at the back door offering to do some labor in exchange for a meal. Black or white, they did not go away hungry. But my mother's parents, the Moods, didn't make waves, and they accepted the world for what it was. And what it was in South Carolina in the 1930s was segregated. A family friend came to dinner one night to the Moods. He lived in rural South Carolina and was a school district executive. There had been some unrest in his work of late concerning the education of the black children in his district. There were complaints about the unequal treatment of the segregated black students. But in the home of the Moods, for an evening, he could escape those nettlesome complaints. Or so he thought. Because much to the dismay and consternation of her parents, my mother, little Betty Smith, volunteered that those black children should go to school with the white children. For this impertinence, she was promptly sent to bed without supper. Mind you, South Carolina did not begin to desegregate their schools formally and legally until 1963, almost 30 years later. Yet as a young girl, without anything in her immediate environment to tell her so, my mother saw the wrongfulness of this system. When I learned about this incident in my adult years, I asked my mother how could she see so clearly what her own parents could not. She said simply, when something is wrong, it's wrong. Steel magnolia from early on. In the 1960s in Springfield, Illinois, the Smiths and their family of 4 boys belonged to a swimming club, really a private business called the Surf Club. This is where I learned to swim, not through formal lessons, but by being yanked from the kiddie pool and thrown into the middle pool by my older brothers when they decided I was old enough. We were a handful for Mother to raise, that's for sure. We were not easy children. In fact, we were often strange and morbid. My younger brother, Andy, and I at one point developed an obsession with the dead man's float. While other children would be frolicking and laughing in the pool, we would be perfecting the dead man's float. Mother would be sunning with the other mothers in the lounge area, and they would ask, "Why, Betty, where are your children?" And she would scan the pool and declare, "Oh, there they are, in the corner of the pool, floating face down in the water." Aghast, the other mothers would exclaim, "Are they all right?" And Mother would cry out somewhat mournfully, "Oh, I hope so." At this very same surf club during this time, a family with 2 white parents adopted a black child. Although they were members of the surf club, they were informed by management that they would no longer be welcome. The family decided not to make an issue of it, but my mother and other concerned mothers found out about it. They gathered together, went to the club, and let management know, either they stay or we all go. Of course, I did not learn any of this until adulthood. Such was my mother's way. But one summer there appeared in the club, amidst all those pink and white bodies, one little black one. Steel magnolias indeed. Both my parents were born and raised in the Carolinas and came to Springfield, Illinois to start a business in late 1953 with 2 small children, with 2 more being born here in subsequent years. My father lost his Southern accent in 6 months. As Debbie has observed, my mother never lost hers. Up north, this rarely escaped notice. My mother was called for jury duty. Part of the process for impaneling a jury involves the attorneys for prosecution and defense asking questions of potential jurists. As soon as my mother opened her mouth to answer a question, the defense attorney exercised one of his peremptory challenges, meaning he dismissed her without cause. His defendant was black. I remember my mother coming home feeling humiliated and her tears as she recounted the story, but she never gave up her Southern accent. Steel magnolia, indeed. Another time we were at a Detroit Tigers baseball game. Dad was a big Tigers fan, and the years we didn't go to the beach, we would often go somewhere where we could catch a Tigers game or two. With a family of 6, Dad didn't splurge on the tickets. We usually sat in the cheapest seats available. Sometimes, and certainly in this case, there were a fair number of black people around us as they, too, took advantage of the lower cost seating. You all may be aware that I am an ardent and loud sports fan. You may think I got that from my father. Well, somewhat, but mostly from my mother, especially the loud part. So this was the 60s, a time of great racial conflict and upheaval. The first inning, the Tigers got a man on, and Willie Horton, the cleanup hitter, comes up. Mother, to encourage the Tigers to score, bellows out in her thick Southern accent, "Come on, Willie, come on, boy, hit the ball!" It was a hot summer day, but even I, a naive, sheltered child, felt a sudden chill in the air. Because one of the ways black men in the Jim Crow South were put in their place was by calling any black male, regardless of age, boy. It was an evil, ugly, and demeaning practice. To this day, I struggle, no matter how young they are, to refer to any black male as a boy. Willie Horton was black. But the next batter came up, and Mother hollered again, "Come on, Jimmy, come on, boy, hit the ball!" Jimmy Northrup was white. There was a slight shift in the mood. And on through the game it went, Mother hollering encouragement to her Tiger boys, black and white. And eventually there were some chuckles that could be heard, and fellow Tiger fans began joining in to cheer the Tigers to victory. I will be forever grateful to those fans, unlike that defense attorney who took the time to see past my mother's accent and perhaps unfortunate word selection. People often talk about parenting as something you're good at or you're not. I became a parent later in life, and what I learned is that parenting is a far more complex thing than that. There are different stages to parenting, and the skill set to be successful at one age is sometimes dramatically different than at the next. Newborns are different from toddlers, toddlers from grade schoolers from middle schoolers from high schoolers from college students, and college students from young adults, and that's as far as I've gotten. So there may be more layers. But one thing is true. Parenting is a process of letting go, and at every stage, you have to let go a little more. I would have to say my mother managed the different levels well. I don't think she had a glaring weak spot in her game. I remember her engaging our minds from early on, reading to us and helping us learn to read. She was aware of differences between her boys and did not engage in the corrosive practice of judging by comparing. One of my brothers was diagnosed as dyslexic earlier than usual because of my mother's perceptiveness, and because of her advocacy, he got special instruction early on to compensate. Mother was always a fierce advocate and defender of her children, but she was not a helicoptering parent. She allowed us remarkable freedom growing up. One of the most challenging times for any parent is the middle school and high school years. At some point during this time, children start to metamorphosize. Stereotypically during this time, girls engage and boys withdraw. Mother had 4 boys, and as they each hit the teen years, one by one, they went through this period of withdrawal. This was especially tough on Mom, as Dad, a small business owner, was away most of the time at work. A joke I sometimes made when asked why I joined the family business was, I wanted to meet my dad. Her little boys grew into awkward, surly creatures who were leaving childhood behind but were nowhere close to being adults. Yet Mother made every effort to stay engaged, to continue to connect with us and support us. I remember one afternoon after school my sophomore year, we were in the kitchen. A family friend once observed, families have different gathering places in the home. The Smiths always gather in the kitchen. It was just Mom and me, and she was gamely trying to engage me in conversation about school, about how I was doing, about anything really, just trying to connect. And I just had nothing to say. Nothing that I could give back beyond monosyllabic mumblings. And the thing was, I knew what she was doing and why, and more than that, I even appreciated it. Not that I was able to give her any clue that I did. I am sure she left the table that day certain that she had accomplished nothing, that she had totally failed. And yet she had succeeded far more than she would have ever guessed. Sometimes parenting is a thankless task. And sometimes in parenting, and in all our life experiences, we are at our best when we think we're at our worst. Mother didn't have any girls. I had no sisters. It wasn't until I had a daughter of my own that I found out what girls engage is like. I had no idea. And if middle school wasn't easy for a boy, it can be hell on earth for a girl. It's kind of like Lord of the Flies without the thin veneer of English schoolboy etiquette. And as for mother-daughter friction, if I had had a sister, I would have bought ringside tickets for those fights. There's one more aspect of life with my mother that I should touch on, because it was the ultimate test of her steel. My mother suffered from depression throughout her life. It manifested itself occasionally in periods of sadness and withdrawal, but more memorably in periods of loud and shockingly profane rants. Now, raising 4 boys is not easy, and I dare say we would have given any mother cause to lose it at times. But what I'm talking about are explosions created by her depression, for which I do not blame her, and for which I had to learn not to blame myself. Depression is an illness, something beyond rational control. Mother would burn so hot during these episodes that she literally couldn't recall what she said. Never, ever did these episodes involve any physical violence, but verbal violence, yes. Mother did get treatment and take medications throughout her life, and because she did, she led a full and productive life. And much of the time, she was able to keep what Winston Churchill called the black dog away, or at least at bay. And during my childhood, I never ceased to be amazed at how Mother could pull it together when she had to. There were, thankfully, rare occasions. I remember when we would have company coming to the house, and Mom was raging and sobbing right up until the doorbell rang. And then somehow, she would find it in herself to pull it together, wipe her eyes, and transform into a gracious Southern hostess. During my preschool years, she was hospitalized for a time, and then came back to try again to handle 4 little boys under the age of 10. She hadn't received a miracle cure, and yet somehow she did it. I asked her much later in life how she managed it. She said that regardless of how she was feeling on a given day, there were 4 little boys who needed taken care of and who were expecting her to do it. And so somehow she did. Steel magnolia indeed. My mother was a brilliant woman, graduating first in her class in high school and at the University of South Carolina. With one caveat, she was tied both times. With whom, do you ask? I gave you a clue. That's right, her twin sister, Anne. It was only as an adult that I figured out that before she was my mom, she was one of the Mood twins. And boy, the Mood twins were something, bright and funny. Despite their middle-class upbringing, when they both married Citadel boys, and Citadel is the military school of South Carolina, when they both married Citadel boys in a double wedding at Columbia, imagine that, a double wedding with identical twin brides. It was a social event of the season. Comedy in the past sometimes involved 2-man acts, a straight man and a goofy guy. Think Abbott and Costello, Lewis and Martin, the Smothers Brothers, Rowan and Martin. You can add that to that list Ann and Betty. When they got together, they were hysterical. Mom was the straight man and Ann the silly one, and they had a whole lifetime to hone their act. It's amazing as an adult to see your parents as other than mom and dad, to realize they were fully fleshed out human beings before you even existed. All of which made for me and my brothers her final years very difficult. This brilliant woman slowly slipped into dementia. I really struggled with it. One time at a University of Illinois event, an old friend of hers asked about visiting her. I explained to her mom's situation, and she certainly could visit her, but be sure to explain who you are and don't plan to stay too long. Oh, she said, Betty and I go way back. She'll remember me. I'm sure my face flushed red. And I replied coldly with the cruel truth. Some days I have to remind her of my name. And yet on her final day, as she succumbed to pneumonia in the surreal time that was the first days of COVID restrictions, when she could say almost nothing, my daughter Callie heard her say more than once, I love you. Steel magnolia to the end. Let's take a moment now for a time of meditation as we think of mothers and mother figures that we have known that have blessed and nurtured us, and for the pain that they may have sometimes caused or that we may have caused them. Help us to bring peace to that situation. So I ask now for a time of silence as we meditate on those wonderful mothers everywhere. Thank you, Divine Spirit, for the love and blessing we all receive. I would now invite Alyssa up to lead us in the post-meditation song, Magic Penny.